Everyone, my name is Brianna Reisinger, and today I'm going to be talking about Lyme disease and specifically the bacteria or microbe that causes this. And this is Borrelia burgdorferi. And we're going to specifically talk about pathogenesis, we're going to talk about epidemiology, treatment, and all the important things that are underlying with this bacterium and the disease and infection that it causes in the human body specifically. So what we know about Lyme disease is that it actually is caused from a tick, and specifically it's caused from the black-legged tick and the deer tick. And there's different species and subspecies of these ticks across the United States, across the country, across the world. And specifically in our areas, it's Zoetis scapularis, and this is considered the deer tick. And this is the most common cases that we see on our side of the country. So we know that ticks can attach to any part of the human body, and particularly they like to hide out in the groin area, the armpit area, anywhere they can pretty much hide. And so you'll find them a lot of times in places where you can't see them. And they also like to hide out in your scalp, which obviously is a place you can't see, and sometimes you can't even see the rashes that occur there. This bacteria has the ability to cause a Lyme disease after about the 36 to 48 hour period of time. Meaning once you are bit and the bacterium is injected into your skin, if you can treat it or see it before this certain period of time, and sometimes it goes even out to 72 hours, you can typically treat it before you can get Lyme disease. And so these ticks have this ability to insert this bacterium, and I will get into the specifics of this later. But we see these different ticks, and across the country, these species cause different symptoms in humans, and I'll also talk about that in the next couple of slides. Willy Borgdorfer, he is the scientist that actually discovered the bacterium itself. He was currently working on another project when he discovered it. And to begin, in the 1970s, the scientists and how we even figured out what Lyme disease was, we figured out these cases were happening and we diagnosed it as Lyme, but we weren't quite sure where it came from. And it wasn't until we saw Willy Borgdorfer, he was studying Rocky Mountain spotted fever at the time, which is also caused by a tick. And it wasn't until he was studying these cases that he actually initially came across the connection between Lyme disease and the deer tick. And when he saw this, he figured out that, oh, there's a correlation between Lyme disease and this tick. And so he actually became the scientist that specifically discovered the bacterium of the Borrelia and its spiral and structure. And he was able to identify that this tick was linked to this disease, and he continuously did research on it, and obviously it was named after him. So he was one of the main primary people that figured this out, and in 1982, this is when he named the bacterium. So the taxonomy of the tick kind of can get a little complicated, and it gets complicated because they're called what's called vectors. So when a tick bites you, it's considered a vector. It's the ability on how they transmit the disease, the infection, or the bacterium. And so ticks have different vectors, and you can see this along here, that all these different ticks in all their different phylum and where they fit into the categories, they're going to be in different categories along the classes. And for specifically the Borrelia, its domain is a bacteria, and its phylum is the Spirochetes, meaning it's a spiral morphology. And I'll also get into the structure a little bit later. And specifically, it breaks down into class, its order, and its family of these specific Spirohelices. And the importance behind this is that we're able to actually go and map where this goes along history, where it can infect people, the host that it infects, and all the important things of where we see it across the world. And so it's super important to know where the taxonomy fits, because we're able to track down these cases and the importance behind how this bacterium is transmitting this disease overall. And so it gives us a good tracking point, and it allows us to identify different species and different phylums as they come along throughout history. So this is super important. So as I talked about a little bit in the last slide, the structure of the Borrelia burgdorferi is a spiral helicase, and its structure is super important on how it actually penetrates the body. And so it belongs to this distinctive morphological group, and this group is known as the Spirochetes. This group holds a unique shape, and it includes a spiral body along with a flagellum that is used for motility. And this flagellum is super important. It actually is basically what helps it push its way through and past the tissues in our body. And so it's located inside the periplasm between the inner and outer cell membranes. And this is what allows for this to move through the viscous fluids and through the tissues in our body. So when that tick bites on our skin, it's injected into our skin via surface receptors. And when it does this, it has to be able to push its way through whatever muscle or, ligaments, tendons, wherever it's going in. And sometimes it's not in the best spot. So the ability for this flagellum to be intertwined with its cell membrane is super important, because this is what allows it to push its way through into the vector. It's its way to get into the body, and this is kind of also what lowers our immune response. It actually kind of hides from our body, which I'll also get into just a second. Pathogenesis. So the pathogenesis isn't horribly quite complicated, because they're still doing research even today. Because the tick, and there's so many different tick species, the difference between one tick carrying Lyme disease to another carrying Lyme disease is that no matter what host it infects, it can affect a human in every different way. We see carditis, and we see problems with the immune system. We see problems with rheumatology, arthritis. And so there's different areas that this Lyme disease can affect, and sometimes it's really hard to follow the pathogenesis of these things. So when we first get bitten by a tick, and this infected tick has to have this bacterium, the Borrelia, and when it has this bacterium, like I said, it'll inject its way into our bodies. And when it does this, the first thing it does is it has the ability to change the surface glycoproteins on its cell surface. And when it does this, it's actually triggering our immune system to recognize it. And usually this will help one's body try to defeat a cell, to get rid of it. But in this case, and specifically Lyme disease and with this bacterium, it actually has a way of working around our immune system, where it actually is able to create these lesions in our skin and creating the pathogenesis, creating the viral product. And instead of being killed, they're actually thriving. So it's quite fascinating. And it can just depend on each person, because we carry different proteins in our bodies, and depending on where the area it's attached to, it's going to use different glycoprotein pathways in order to get into the body. And when this happens, I kind of talked about it, it stimulates the response of inflammatory cells, and this is basically our immune response. So when you first get bit by a tick, the first reaction isn't to get Lyme disease. If you can treat it before this, you get the rash, you get skin heat, you can even get a fever, you don't feel very well, you can get really itchy, and it depends. Some people don't notice it at all, because there's some ticks that are even larvae or premature larvae when they bite you, and they're so small that you can't even see them. And so this is important, because it's basically the red area around our skin, wherever you do get bitten, is what shows that inflammatory response. In the next sentence, I have that the bacterium activates proteases and other induced host cell molecules to allow for dissemination through the blood. This means movement through the blood throughout the body, being able to infect basically around the body and create that rash that we see in our skin, and into other tissues as well. So this is how it spreads. It basically can get into the bloodstream, which is why it can move so quickly. And this also creates these lesions I was talking about, and it can affect the joints, the heart, and your nervous tissue in cases where Lyme disease occurs. And so kind of what I talked about in the importance of the pathogenesis of this is that variation includes both genetic differences from person to person and among strains of the bacterium, and difference in the host responses. So specifically in cases that I've seen, some of the most common things I hear of are Lyme disease leading to arthritis. And so these are things that we're looking to treat in the pathogenesis behind this, and that triggers different pathways than someone who would be infected in their heart, or leading to Lyme disease that have problems in their heart. And so this is kind of the pathogenesis of what happens when this bacterium gets into our skin and it turns into Lyme disease, or it leads into the infection that we see on our skin. Epidemiology. So where can we see this? So basically, a tick actually isn't the first place where this bacterium lays. The tick actually feeds off of other mammals or birds that ingest this bacterium, and this is how the tick inherits this bacterium itself. And so basically, the United States is this bacterium the only pathogen that causes Lyme disease. So this bacterium in the United States is the only thing that will cause specifically Lyme disease. And so when we look at this map, we can see that it's definitely over here inside of the mid-Atlantic states, Wisconsin and also Minnesota, and those are where we see a lot of the heavy cases. We see a few over here on the coast in the Pacific Northwest. California has higher rates than we do normally, but it's definitely possible, and over the last couple years even, we've seen a huge uptick in tick populations and Lyme disease, and it's continuously spreading. So this infection and this bacterium relies on a geographical change. And so when we go country to country, some countries have a lot of cases, some don't, just dependent on how this can move and how it travels. And this is really important because epidemiology is mapped. And to be able to look after these cases and look after Lyme disease, we have to be able to watch where these things are going. And so in Europe, most cases occur in Scandinavian countries and Central Europe. And so, like I said, these things are resistant to geographical change, and they can't move unless they are moved. And this is super important because as cases move, so does infection, and so does ticks, and so does the bacterium. So we can kind of map all of these things together. And this is super important to be able to keep up on the pathogenesis as well. Treatment and prevention. So it's kind of funny to think about because how do you protect yourself from a bacterium that is specifically in ticks that can give you Lyme disease? Well, it's super important. You can check your clothing for ticks when you're going outside into grassy areas, into forests, when you go camping. Like I said, sometimes they're in the very larval or pre-larval stages, and they're so small, they're half the size of, even a dime, even smaller than that. So it's really hard to see them, and in these cases, you won't be able to stop the infection from spreading if you do get Lyme disease, because sometimes you don't even show the rash symptoms. So it's super important that you wear clothing that covers and protects your skin, your whole body, especially in areas like the Midwest where these are very prominent. You want to make sure that you're trying to protect yourself from the black-legged or deer tick. You can wear repellents, basically insect repellents, but you have to look for the certain ingredients that talk about ticks and the protection from ticks and things that can keep you from the spray that allows you to specifically repel the ticks that are in your area. Be on the lookout. It's super important that if you are going to go outside, you're going to go into these grassy fields, you're going to go into areas like this, that you're checking your body, you're checking everything. If you decide you're going on a picnic and you're not wearing full-on clothing when you get back to the house, it's super important to check for these things. And in cases where you do get Lyme disease, after the prevention, after the fact, there's a series of antibiotics that can be into play that can be kind of tricky because they are treated based on the types of symptoms and conditions that you do have. So if someone has the carditis in your heart for the idea of Lyme disease, then they're going to take a different antibiotic than someone who has the arthritis symptoms of the portion of the Lyme disease. And then the same thing for the nervous tissue. It's going to be completely different, and these antibiotics can last over a series for a couple weeks. But the good news is that it's completely treatable, and it's super important that we know that this bacterium is treatable. So we're still doing research today on the ideas behind this bacteria and basically the pathogenesis and our treatment and prevention and how we can try to further prevent causes other than just wearing good clothing and trying to protect these things. And so today I hope you learned a little bit about the presentation of the bacterium and about Lyme disease, and I look forward to seeing you guys very soon. Thank you.